2023 might just be the best of the best, full of so many amazing titles and new and existing IP alike, big budget bangers, indie darlings, and things we just haven't seen before. Along with that though, also comes some of the biggest disappointments and tragedies in recent memory from studios that I at one point considered my favorites. You know, it's crazy that in a year so full of amazing games and experiences, that one still so clearly is the best of them all, or at least the one most deserving of a Game of the Year status. Not only because of its immense quality, but also because of how it propelled an entire otherwise niche genre into the mainstream and showed the world just how great hardcore RPGs can really be with this amount of love and care put into them. And that game is Gollum. No, I'm just kidding, it's Baldur's Gate 3. Because you see, Baldur's Gate 3 is more than just another great RPG in a landscape so full of them. Whatever that phrase even means anymore. It's a game that was 6 years in the making, of which 3 were spent in early access getting feedback from players and fans alike, and all of these learnings, along with experience from making their Divinity series, allowed Larian to finally make a game that could lift this underrated genre of CRPGs into the spotlight, becoming one of the most popular releases in history, topping the charts on Steam and consoles alike. The real crowning achievement of this game though is how Larian was able to finally put the role-playing back in role-playing games, and craft a journey that not only was full of countless great characters and deep mechanics, but also a world that radically realized so many of your actions, allowing a sense of player agency with high production values unlike anything we've ever seen before. I said it back in my original First Impressions review of the game when it was released, and I'll say it again. What really makes Baldur's Gate 3 so special is that it isn't just another RPG. It's in many ways even more of an immersive sim, focused on making a playground that you can make your own. Depending on what class you play as, what race you pick, and all of the decisions you make in dialogue, or even just what spells you use and where, drastically affect how the game plays out and what it becomes. There are entire massive locations full of lore and quests that can only be accessed if you are searching meticulously through each environment and stumble upon a secret passageway. And while this means almost no players will ever see everything this game has to offer, what you do discover feels so much more impactful and memorable because it was something you did, not just another adventure the main narrative and cutscenes took you down. More than anything though, Baldur's Gate 3 is, at least for me, exactly what games as a medium should be all about, letting you solve every situation in any way you see fit, and crafting believable reactions to almost anything you can think of. This isn't just leveling up your speech skill and passing a dialogue check like in many other RPGs. You often have to come up with solutions to problems in the environment on your own, and when you do get speech checks, instead of it just being a boring pass or fail, you get to experience the thrill of rolling a set of dice like at a table with D&D and adding modifiers to see if you succeed. And even if you do fail, it often leads to some of the coolest and funniest encounters and moments in the entire game. A system like this is honestly how most RPGs should be doing it, where chance and luck play an integral part in the fun, and more importantly in making your playthrough special and your own. And speaking of special, every choice you make massively affects the world and your experience in it. For example, as a druid, you can turn into a spider and speak to evil arachnids underground and convince them to join a spider queen and rebel. Or you can transform into a wolf in town and watch as innocent civilians freak out and run for their lives. Or maybe you even decide you want to become a bear in a much more intimate moment. And all of these interactions are specific to just the druid class. That one simple decision you made at the start of your game cascades into its own unique and flavorful playthrough even hundreds of hours later. If you are a gnome, you can fit into small holes and hard to reach places without spells, be made fun of by kids for how short you are, or be subjugated to less movement per turn. As a drow ranger, you can completely bypass entire encounters in the first act of the game, as the goblins will cower in fear when you walk by them because of the stories they have heard of your kind, instead of fighting you like they usually would. Even from the moment you hit the character creation screen, everything in Baldur's Gate 3 is just such a breath of fresh air, where every decision you make, no matter how big or small, can result in drastic effects to the world and story that you uncover, and it makes every single time you level up so fun, where every new spell can completely change how you roleplay as your character or your party. In the first act alone, there are hundreds of options you can use to assault a massive goblin camp, for instance. You can talk your way in, poison the local food and water supply so everyone dies without even casting a single spell, cover your face in dung so the goblins all laugh at you and let you through, summon a horde of massive ogres to cause chaos, go in and murder hobo everything, or just act like you are siding with them and then at the last second betray them all when they least expect it. In fact, you might even set up a string of hundreds of explosive barrels that you then set off miles away, which kills everything in an instant. And it's that level of agency and freedom which separates and elevates games above the likes of movies and books in the first place, and the main reason I'm so passionate about this industry. No matter what you choose to do in Baldur's Gate 3, there is a believable and interesting reaction from the game that shows you firsthand this is a playground whose only limit in most cases is your own imagination. And isn't that what RPGs were always about from their inception? Becoming digital versions of the freedom we see in tabletop games like Dungeons and Dragons. Because games can provide experiences like this where the story truly becomes your own. No two playthroughs will quite be the same. And on top of this too, in combat or even just traversing the world, it's so amazing. You can get spells that allow you to fly up to the top of buildings or sneak up on foes or NPCs, or other incantations that transform you into a gaseous form to quite literally travel through pipes or small cracks in infrastructure to get to never before seen spots. For me too, the turn-based nature of the combat itself is so good because of how tactical it is and how much it makes you think, especially as a player who is completely new to the genre in Dungeons and Dragons. You will go up against epic monsters that are huge in size and seemingly with infinite health pools, along with spells that can wipe your party in an instant. And you still can find a way to win, not through mind-numbing number crunching like in the Pathfinder series, but through actually using the environment, pushing people to their death, and just trying out things to see how spells interact with the world and environment. Even for people that aren't into games with a camera system like this or combat that is turn-based, the game itself and the systems on offer here are so good that it makes it all worth it. Trust me, even if you don't think this game looks like it's for you, once you start playing and truly see how open-ended everything you can do is, and how much the game will react to those things you do, you'll realize what makes it so special and why it's the game of the year. And the thing is, all of this in one package is really what makes Baldur's Gate 3 the clear game of the year, even in a 12-month period filled to the brim with so many great titles. Because you see, it's so rare we get a game that's not only so long and full of content, but one where all of that content is also of the highest quality and interacts with one another seamlessly. And on top of that, the studio, Larian, behind it all, has continued to push patch after patch long after release, improving so many parts of the game, even for free, adding hours of content at the end of the game to flesh out what was otherwise a rushed and horrible ending to a great journey, on top of patching the countless bugs and issues you would run into much later in the second half of the journey that most people didn't even know about at first because of how long it took to even get there. This level of commitment and care for the game and customer base is what so many people love to see in this industry, and it proves the secret to making a great game is having a great studio, or in other words, great leadership. In fact, for me, the only big downside to this game is the romance. It feels like every single companion and character is trying to fornicate with you constantly, and the over-sexualization of absolutely everything, even the villains themselves, becomes so tiring and sad to see when it's obvious how good the writers otherwise were. They fell into the trap we see nowadays in everything, everyone over-sexualizing themselves and others. It would have been so much better if most of the characters were more focused on their journey and arc as a person, instead of just feeling like a vessel that's trying to convince me to go to bed with them. But despite all of that, much of the writing and moments are still so memorable, and cool companion stories and quests make up for all the times they made me feel uncomfortable back at camp. And for me, Baldur's Gate 3 is just the best RPG ever made, on the whole at least, because it did so many things right and has so much content at such a high bar of quality and production value that it quite literally is unlike anything else we've ever seen in this space before, and in many ways sets a new standard other studios will surely be looking to achieve in the future. It has close to the openness of a Skyrim, the party dynamics of a Mass Effect or Dragon Age, the deep systematic design of a Prey or Deus Ex, with a mechanical depth approaching the Pathfinder series. Or in other words, my dream game, besides the whole not being in sci-fi part. An instant classic that decades from now will be looked back on with so much nostalgia from those of us playing now as not only the game of the year, but a game that will hopefully transform the industry and medium for the better going forward. One of the few games to reach legendary status upon even its initial release. And you can't ask for much more from a game of the year than that, can you? However, Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't the only title that reached for the stars in 2023. But sadly, not everything hit the mark. Because Starfield, without a doubt, was my biggest disappointment for any game I played all year. You see, I've been a fan of Bethesda games ever since I was a kid, and loaded up my first role-playing game of all time, The Elder Scrolls Oblivion. I'll never forget that original adventure where I stepped out of the sewers and was greeted with what at the time was graphics that blew my mind, but more importantly, a world that was begging to be conquered. And ever since then, I've been playing Bethesda games for that exact feeling, a special one that strangely only their games seem to be able to evoke, and also the thing that makes them so ubiquitous for gamers everywhere. There truly just aren't any other titles out there that give you the same sense of adventure and freeform exploration. But sadly, in Starfield, while it managed to do so many things better than previous Bethesda titles in a setting I enjoy so much more, along the way, it lost a lot of the magic too. Because you see, Starfield is a game of immense scope. There are literally 1,000 planets to explore, all with their own biomes, flora and fauna alike. But after only exploring a few handful a couple of hours in, you start seeing the cracks in the formula. Every new location is full of the exact same dungeons and events, with identical sets of enemies, loot, and stories. That first time you enter an underground cavern full of alien and human skeletons alike, it evokes that great sense of Bethesda environmental storytelling that lights a fire in our imaginations. But when you stumble upon that very same scene on 3 nearby and faraway planets, you realize it's all a facade. Unlike Bethesda's previous titles, exploration in this game is much more procedurally generated and randomized. Because while all Bethesda games use this tech for things like the environments in Oblivion or Radiant Quests in Skyrim, walking around still felt like a handmade and tailored experience. However, in Starfield, it feels more formulaic, robotic, and more importantly, devoid of heart and soul. But I want to make one thing clear too. This game gets a lot of hate, and mainly for the problems with exploration I just described. Despite all of that though, what Bethesda did here could work and could be absolutely amazing. And the reason Starfield was the most disappointing year of the game for me is because so many of the ideas in this game are grand on paper, but the execution just falls so short. For example, the quests in the game are actually, in my opinion, in many ways the best Bethesda has ever done. If we are being totally honest, they've never really been that great at quests or writing. There were a handful of good ones in Oblivion and Morrowind, but even in those titles, the real magic came from just venturing out into the world and making a story for yourself. In Starfield though, a good amount of the quests actually have more choice and consequence, more intrigue packed in with multiple sides and political tensions that flesh out the world and its people, at least some. But for every quest that has an interesting setup, so many also fall flat when you actually begin to play. Many of the adventures you go on involve things like arduously traveling from planet to planet full of load screens just so you can go to one kiosk that takes 10 minutes to walk to in order to fill out one form, after which you immediately teleport back to the previous planet you were on and suffer through more endless load screens in order to tell the quest giver you accomplished your goal. From a lore perspective, I understand why communication in Starfield seldom uses devices that allow NPCs to speak at a great distance, but it makes the actual structure and design of many of the quests so tedious to go through. And on top of this, even more damning, so much of the writing and even main and faction quests, let alone the side stuff, is absolutely unbelievably lazy and bad. By now you've probably seen countless videos comparing dialogue in games like Cyberpunk to Starfield, and while gamers tend to exaggerate usually, in this case, Starfield's dialogue really is as bad as it looks in many cases. I distinctly and vividly remember so many quests where I would be in search of super important artifacts or a secret stash, and when I came upon the guard restricting my access to said things, the dialogue and speech skills I had spec'd into allowed me to, no joke, tell the guard that he should let me past or have his things, because otherwise, and this isn't an exaggeration, I would annoy him. And lo and behold, this worked every time. A simple one-off instance of this happening would be funny and play into the lackadaisical nature of most Bethesda quests, but when it happens on over half the journeys I'm taking on, it becomes a massive roadblock to my immersion. Even in the main quest, I'll never forget the big reveal partway through and meeting meeting the main adversary for the first time, where a lot of the secrets as to what's really been going on get revealed to you in what might be the single worst 10 minutes of writing in a video game I've ever seen without hyperbole. I genuinely cannot imagine how this moment, which is supposed to be awesome and awe-inspiring, could be any worse. And if you've played the game, you know exactly what I'm talking about. If anything, I would have wished we never made first contact. And it goes back to that core idea that this game has so much potential but refuses to ever reach it, and instead becomes a hugely disappointing adventure through a world where you constantly ask yourself what could have been. Even things like crafting and base building are passable but not as good as previous titles like Fallout 4. Planets are boring after exploring just a couple, and quests and writing especially can be so bad at times that I struggle to even understand where it all went wrong. Games like Cyberpunk and Mass Effect were so much better because the stories felt real, with characters that had intensity, heart, and intrigue. In Starfield, all your companions feel like people written for a kid's show that had no interesting motives, voice acting that feels uninspired and lazy, and one-liners so cringy it made them feel less like people and more like weird animatronic NPCs with scary facial animations. And the reason all of this is so disappointing is the potential the game otherwise had. A full universe with the Bethesda-style exploration sounds amazing on paper. Finally, another big-budget sci-fi RPG that could rival Mass Effect, but it never even gets close. I will say though, this game has a lot of great stuff too. There are countless systems at play here, including crafting, building, exploring, tons of quests, tons of planets, multiple massive cities, lots of different alien wildlife and plants, and in my opinion, by far the best interior designs Bethesda's ever had. There were so many times in this game I would just be walking around a planet and look out into the distance as a massive moon or sun took over the horizon, or the sky filled with bright stars, or walking around a massive interior to a mega structure built by humanity that was home to so many interesting architectural choices, and even ships that you could build yourself and then walk around in, full of so much love, care, and passion. Or what about things like ship combat, which I personally found to actually be quite good, or seemingly endless perks to build out your character in whatever way you see fit. There's a lot to like about Starfield too, and despite all of its issues, it's still an overall fun game to just turn your mind off and play. The main problem is it just doesn't have any of that quote-unquote magic that Bethesda games of old so perfectly captured. It's a title that reached for the stars, but got confused about what it was really trying to be along the way. But maybe no other part of this game reveals to the world its issues more than the main quest, one that without exaggeration could have been the greatest main story in a game of all time, but instead, once again, was mindless and boring. So allow me to speak more about spoilers here in the last part of this section, and if you don't want to hear those, make sure to skip ahead to the next, which I'll put timestamps down for in the description below. You see, Starfield's main story is about multiple universes and dimensions, where at the end of the game you discover that you can either stay in your universe or leave everyone behind and become a Starborn, where you will adventure out into entirely new galaxies. But you see, the issue is while the idea is so awesome on paper, what this really means is you'll just be getting a different start to the Constellation questline. It's cool walking in and seeing all the members are now kids, or all the members are dead, or even maybe all of them are you from a different dimension. It's cool, funny, and interesting, especially at first, but the more you beat the main quest and discover new dimensions, the more you realize it's all just a cheap parlor trick. There are only a handful of moments where you get new dialogue options for being a Starborn. There are only a handful of moments where you get new dialogue options for being a Starborn on the quests you had before, and they barely change anything. And not only that, but the planets are largely just exactly the same. Imagine how much more emotional these moments with your companions could have been, with them crying and saying they will miss you, and realizing you would have to give up on family and everyone you know in order to make the ultimate adventure worth it. It would have made us think about the decision so much more. And while Bethesda attempted to do this some at the end, talking about what happens in your current universe, it all just falls so flat again compared to how cool the moment could have been. And once again, I can't stress enough how much of a missed opportunity this really was. And once again, it shows how lazy in execution Bethesda was here. probably because they spread themselves too thin on the systems and content in this game. Imagine if instead every time you traveled to a new parallel universe, the planets completely changed. New planets suddenly appeared, and places you know and love like Aquila City suddenly had new banners, new colors, and slightly tweaked history for you to explore and uncover, along with quests that were specific to that universe. This may sound like a far-fetched idea, but the groundwork for this is already there. Bethesda could have focused on using their procedural tech for things like this. Instead of 1,000 planets that are basically the same for each universe, put 50 in each and just randomize it each time the player switches universes. How much better would that feel? It would make it appear like the game had just endless amounts of interesting places to explore and content to go over, and it would give you a reason to keep playing. And on top of this, the focus and content should have been procedural quests, instead of so many faction quests that, while okay, often had bad writing and a lack of deep emotions. Bethesda could have instead focused most of their efforts on more procedural stuff that could randomly spawn on planets. That way you would get the feeling that the world was more alive and worth exploring. Trust me, there is tons of content in this game. It's just the actual design of that content went to the wrong place. The game took the risk to make exploration so procedural, but it didn't also take the necessary risk of making all of the content the same too. Starfield should have been a game that did away with faction quests, side quests, and even for the most part, a lot of the main quest. The focus should have been making sure that every planet you landed on had new and interesting content that all intertwined, and then at the end, when you went to new universes, it procedurally generated entire new tile sets that would make it feel like a game that you could play, as Todd always wanted, for decades on decades. Because that game, I think, would capture maybe not the same, but a new sense of magic for Bethesda. But instead, they have one foot in this grand new idea and one foot back in the old RPG ways of standard quests and factions, something they've never really done well and aren't done well here either. Starfield needed to be something new. It was a brand new IP from a beloved studio, and it was their chance to take the ultimate risk. But instead, it's just a jumbled mess of ideas. And that's why it's my most disappointing game this year, but also one I really do hope can be improved with tons of mods and DLC in the future, because there's so much potential lying beneath all the cracks. There's almost nothing I like more in games than an amazing world with deep lore, along with a narrative that makes the universe come alive and feel lived in with its own personality. And that's because as much as great gameplay and controls are paramount to games as a whole, it's those stories and worlds that stick with me. Not how great a game felt to play at the time, I already have enough fun games to play. It's the exact reason I originally fell so in love with the Mass Effect series, and to this day still think the first entry is by far the best, despite the gameplay being the worst. But sadly, it's also something that is so seldom pulled off well in games, meaning the select few that do really stick with me. So when I first heard that Owlcat would be making a CRPG set in the well-known Warhammer 40k universe, I knew it would be the perfect time to finally jump in and get engrossed in the setting I for so long had avoided. You see, this was actually the year I finally started getting into the CRPG genre in general. After giving Baldur's Gate 3 a shot, I decided I wanted to go back and play some of the greats that this niche and hardcore community had. And what I discovered is that it might be one of the best, if not the best genres out there, full stop. From modern classics like Wasteland 3, Pillars of Eternity, and Tyranny, to old masterpieces like Planescape Torment, the genre is so full of deep mechanics and interesting worlds that I couldn't help but fall in love. And Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader is no different, breathing life into one of the most interesting settings out there with some of the most insane lore I've ever seen. You see, Warhammer 40k is all about, well, war. And in Rogue Trader, this immediately becomes apparent. You play as a newly appointed Rogue Trader who has the rights from the God Emperor to travel to the fringes of the known galaxy and discover new trading routes, enemies, and adventures along the way. It's not often in fantasy that you get to start out feeling like the king with infinite money and resources, but here it all works. Because Warhammer is so full of warring and massive factions that being a Rogue Trader is essentially an entry point for having any sort of power. And considering considering some of the foes and interdimensional beings you will go up against, you're gonna need all the help you can get. What really makes the lore and world building in this title so good though is just how gritty it is, how unforgiving the world can really be. Even on your capital ship, you quickly come to realize that this hulking brute is only kept afloat through manpower of thousands of essentially slaves working on the lower decks, who must work non-stop until their bodies give out, toiling away on machines and electronics to help your ship traverse the unknown. And for some unlucky few as well, they're even transformed into servitors, which are half human, half machine hybrids, which are forced to work away no matter what. You get to visit planets full of millions of innocent people who might succumb to religious fanatics. You get to decide the fate of quite literally entire portions of the galaxy, all because you were given a right from birth from a galaxy-spanning fascist regime. The stakes are unbelievably high, and because of that, everything you do feels so important. Every new colony you establish, new boss you decide to kill or spare, and any encounter with anyone feels like it could spark a rebellion that would ruin the lives of millions. It's everything that makes the 40K setting so great in the first place, a focus on the brutality, violence, and war of it all, and for someone like me who has never dived into the Warhammer setting, it immediately hooked me. On top of that too, the game is a lot of fun with so many deep builds and classes to explore, a large variety of planets and stories to uncover, including abandoned space stations and ships drifting in eerie parts of space. And while the game and especially combat starts slow and most of the dialogue isn't voice acted, meaning it can at times feel like you're reading an interactive novel more than playing a game, because of how deep and fascinating the lore is here, it keeps you engaged the whole time. There are even machine spirits that must be prayed to in order to keep high-tech machinery going, faster than light travel that is achieved by hiring so-called navigators, with a literal third eye they use to peer into what is called the warp, an alternate dimension full of twisted monsters and horrors alike. And the smaller, more human stories are just as good too, about people fighting for an ancient god emperor trapped in a tomb because of a duty they feel to protect the human race, those just trying to keep their families alive, and others who serve the will of all-knowing gods stuck in parallel dimensions. The setting lends itself to so many interesting narratives that can be spun up, and the intensity of it all, with violence and evil everywhere you look at, make it a universe that is hard to stomach at times, but one you can't stop thinking about. Even things like traveling from one solar system to another involves mountains of text that inform you as the captain about the horrific hallucinations poorer people undergo in the warp dimension on the lower decks during jumps, or tales from each planet you capture and maintain as they develop with interesting sci-fi stories that are as fascinating as they are gruesome and brutal. And to me, that's what makes for the best type of lore and world building. Settings where you can't help but not look away and wonder what the true evils and powers out there are in a universe so grand and infinite. So when you tie that in with super deep turn-based mechanics where you will be meticulously thinking about each move, it makes playing Warhammer 40K Rogue Trader such an engaging time. Don't get me wrong, it's a game that requires a lot of you, whether that be copious amounts of reading, build crafting and synergizing, or settlement and trade management, but if you really dedicate the amount of time this game begs for you and dive into things like the encyclopedia and different worlds and all their rich lore, you really come out with a newfound or strengthened love for one of the most long-standing fantasy sci-fi universes out there. To be honest, as someone that always thought Warhammer looked kind of cringy and weird with the buff space marines and endless armies of monsters, this is the first game that finally made me understand why the world of Warhammer is so beloved by so many, and it has some of the rawest and coolest lore I've ever seen in a game setting. For life now, I'm always going to be looking for more Warhammer content because the universe is just that awesome. And even with all the bugs the game had on its initial release and the issues with things like long turn timers and hard to understand mechanics, it's not often we get a new game series that provides a world and lore to get so utterly lost in. So trust me, if you love great sci-fi or storytelling, give this underrated game a shot. And speaking of underrated, in a year like this one full of so many amazing games, there are bound to be some that fall through the cracks. Games that in another year or time would have made a bigger splash and found more hype, but sadly didn't quite find the sizable audience they really deserve. And in this case, I think the most underrated game of many in 2023 would have to be Remnant 2. You see, I've always liked looter shooters, whether it be Borderlands, Destiny, Outriders, or Warframe, but if I'm being frank, I always seem to grow bored of them sim rather quickly. Without a big group to play with that is constantly on, they lose a lot of what makes them special. And while that's certainly also the case for Remnant 2, the ways in which it does mix things up and the methodologies to difficulty and bosses make it such a breath of fresh air. Usually looter shooters feel like such easy and thus boring games, where enemies are easy to kill and avoid, and bosses are just giant bullet sponges that test patience more than skill. In Remnant 2 though, everything is designed more like Dark Souls but with guns, where even some smaller enemies can kill you quickly, and many of the bosses have full in-depth mechanics that take time to learn and master, especially on the harder difficulties. For me, it adds to what this genre was really missing, an actual sense of challenge that makes every moment more tense and interesting. And on top of that, the world itself is so beautiful and well crafted, with tidbits and lore about each location that are fascinating despite an otherwise forgettable main story. At the core of it all too is what's always most important about games like this, the combat. And here Remnant 2 once again shines, allowing you to spec into many different types of builds that rely on things like dodging, casting spells, weapon special abilities, being tanky with armor, or even becoming a superhero shooting lightning out of your fingertips. There's so many different guns, mods, and builds in this game, and because everyone can multi-class between all of the available playstyles, there's tons of depth in the build variety, and it's only further exemplified in groups. For example, my first character I built to summon things to fight for me while also healing everything around me. So I would run around the battlefield setting off chaos, all while healing from all the damage I was taking. It was great. And once again, the key behind it all is the difficulty. For almost all of the classes in game, for example, you don't just get to choose them from a UI and go. You have to search through each environment, solve puzzles, discover secrets, and defeat giant great monsters if you want the best things. And in Remnant 2, this can literally be entire classes or playstyles that you accidentally stumble upon in a secret passageway most players might miss. Actual challenge and intrigue like this do make the experience a lot more hardcore than say something like Destiny 2, but I think that honestly is for the better, because it also makes all of your accomplishments matter that much more. And it also means when playing in multiplayer with random people, players will often help each other find things that others missed, because then everyone gets to unlock extra power they didn't know about before, and it makes the whole community feel more fun, inviting, and thriving. Overall, it really is just such a fantastic game, and one I genuinely can't believe hasn't gotten more love from across the gaming landscape. It's a shame too, because it's the exact breath of fresh air the genre needed, and feels amazing and fun to play with super meaty combat, real challenge, and great sound design, along with a really good score. Even in a year full of so many amazing titles to try, Remnant 2 still stands near the top of that list as a game that many people would love, but lots haven't even heard about. As many of you who have been watching my channel for a while know, Prey from Arcane Studios is one of my favorite games of all time, and in my opinion, its DLC Mooncrash is quite literally the most underrated game content ever that almost no one's played. So when that same studio announced to the world that they would be working on a new IP set in a vampire wasteland, including multiplayer and immersive sim elements from titles we loved before, I was instantly sold. But you see, because Prey didn't do well commercially, along with a lot of internal issues, the most important people from that project ended up leaving to found a new company before this new vampire game, Redfall, even saw the light of day. And well, when it finally did get released, it broke my heart. A studio that I at one point considered my favorite in the entire industry, making games with a design and worlds that spoke so specifically to me, that while niche were so much better than anything out there, released one of the worst titles of the year. You see, on the surface, Redfall actually has a good setup. You play as a handful of survivors who find themselves on an island inhabited by paranormal super vampires and their loyal followers. And it's your job, along with any friends so you choose, to fight and loot your way through the entire island as you uncover the story as to what's really going on. It should have in many ways been a home run, a Masquerade the Bloodline style vampire immersive sim with looter shooter elements combining the awesome strategy of immersive simulation games, all while playing with friends. The world is beautiful, full of great sound design, and certain parts of the story were even awesome. But none of that mattered, because at its core, Redfall was an unfinished, uninspired mess, and an obvious warning sign that a studio that had just before crafted one of the greatest games of all time has faltered so much. It's funny too, because Redfall honestly isn't as bad as most people say. If you play it for yourself, some of the ambiance and environments are breathtaking, and the setting is really interesting to just run around in. But the second you start trying to go on missions or engage in combat with some of the most brain-dead AI imaginable, it all just falls apart. On top of that too, many of the powers and skills in the game, while fine, don't reach the same heights of design, from things like blinking in Dishonored or mimicking matter in Prey to turn into a coffee cup to get into hard to reach places. And also, the level design is just leagues below what has been before from Arcane. Honestly, it feels like a watered down version of the style of game that made Arcane such a pivotal studio before. And on top of that, the characters in game are so cringy and awkward, it's hard to even play without muting them half the time with their strange and nonsensical one-liners. The thing that makes this game so heartbreaking though is that under all of these mistakes is a soul to a game that could have been great. Snippets of brilliance that harken back to the feelings you would get playing Arcane games before, like engaging stealth levels or environments filled to the brim with dark and foreboding lore. You can feel that somewhere in here is the game we all wanted, the game Arcane fans were begging for, and the reason Redfall's release had so many people talking about how Arcane never misses. And it's just so sad to see, because this studio made so many amazing, underrated games for so long, with so much innovation, and yet when finally everyone was talking about them and how great they were, when the hype was finally reaching its crescendo and it was time for Arcane to shine, they dropped the ball so hard, along with so many at the studio being gone by this point. It's truly heartbreaking knowing that such a talented team of developers that synergized so well and really gave it their all never got the full recognition they deserved before things started falling apart. Imagine if Baldur's Gate 3, for example, never got the recognition this year it deserved and then caused Larian to suffer, making their next game only a shadow of the former. Well, that's what happened to Arcane Austin. I'm telling you, for any of you who haven't played Prey, that game is on the level of a Baldur's Gate 3, but just in a different genre, and it never got the recognition it deserved. And especially its DLC Prey Mooncrash is beyond underrated. But despite all of that, the true mark of a studio and what they're made of is how they bounce back, how they respond in the face of adversity. And I hope more than anything that the developers at Arcane Austin take this mistake in stride and learn with a fire in their hearts to show the world that they still have what it takes to make some of the greatest and most interesting games out there, but only time will tell. Because after all, time can change a lot, and in the case of Cyberpunk 2077 and its disastrous launch, compared to how it's been received after the release of Phantom Liberty, it couldn't be any more night and day. It's another game I talk about constantly on this channel because even from the initial release of Cyberpunk, I've been in love with what this game had to offer. Despite all the bugs, all the bogglingly bad AI, and all the controversy, I never stopped loving this game for the things it always did so right, even from day one. There has never been a world with more real and alive feeling characters and companions, or a universe that gripped me quite as much with how its stories were told and how music and emotional moments were put as the priority over mindless fun. Which, by the way, there's also a lot of that too. And Phantom Liberty only improves upon this already great structure, and is a shining swan song to a game that already deserves so much love, but was shrouded by the mistakes of leadership lying or deceiving the fanbase. And that's because I think Phantom Liberty might just be the biggest comeback in games history, period. Walking through the streets of Dogtown and listening to Kurt Hansen announce his plans for the people, looking up into the sky and seeing it littered with drones and skyscrapers, or just traversing the desolate and rundown streets at night as gangs watch and discuss. It's a foreboding wasteland, but also a beautiful one. And the story told in this new location of Night City is one of the best in the whole game. With a cast of Hollywood actors and superb performances alike, it once again shows that the core of the Cyberpunk series isn't the combat or action sequences, but those slower moments with characters. Throughout the entire runtime of the Phantom Liberty campaign, you will be questioning who is on your side, who might betray you, and what is going on. It's a spy thriller that lives up to the name and keeps you on the edge of your seat the entire time, and once again, just like the base game, the endings are absolutely fantastic and strive to make us think and truly feel deep emotions rather than just being another bog standard good or bad ending. On top of this too, alongside Phantom Liberty, CD Projekt Red shipped the 2.0 update, and since then the 2.1 update to the base game as well, which added so many needed combat reworks, a better UI and user experience, more ways to play, and so many small tweaks and improvements that all just come together and finally finally make the game what so many people expected on day one. Not only is Cyberpunk 2077 now my single favorite cast of characters in any medium ever, with the immense amount of emotions they can pull out of you, but also it's now one of the most fun RPGs to play full stop. Enemy AI has improved, and along with that we saw reworks to things like the hacking system and melee combat, which fleshes each out so much more and makes sure that no matter what build you choose to play in game, you're going to have an awesome time. The Metro system was finally added back to the game. You can now listen to music on the go while walking, and gangs will chase you down if you wrong them. Or in other words, Cyberpunk 2077 finally reached all the heights and promises it showed us so many years ago in that initial trailer. And so with that comes the biggest comeback of the year by a long shot, where a game that for years was dragged through the mud finally is seeing the light of day. And I can't express how awesome of a feeling that really is. As someone that from day one was screaming how great this story was, how masterful the writing could be, and most of all how meaningful and deep the narrative could be, eclipsing in my opinion even the likes of The Witcher, Last of Us, Red Dead Redemption 2, and even Mass Effect, this game was always special because it always had what most games could only dream of. Characters that truly meant something, and a journey that would make you think and maybe even affect your soul along the way. And there are so many scenes you experience when playing where the intensity of what is happening on screen truly affects you, and it's so much grittier and more emotional than most titles even dare to try to be. No topic is off the table, whether it be death, offing oneself, loss, abuse, and all of these ideas are tackled in such a mature and real way that make it stand above so much other writing in this entire medium. The issues and bugs and glitches, or even missing features, all paled in comparison to what we did get even from day one. And now with Phantom Liberty and all of the updates, this game is now beloved by so many. I can't tell you how many people I saw online that used to trash this game are now calling it their favorite of all time. Once people saw how raw, how real, and how captivating the writing, voice acting, and set pieces were in this game, without all the commotion about why it sucked online, it became easier to just enjoy the game for what it was and not what it isn't. And I'm just happy to see that after all the work the developers put in, people's opinions have completely changed, and this game will now forever live on in the pantheon of the greatest games ever made and the hearts and souls of so many. Without a doubt, in my opinion, the biggest comeback in gaming history, and who doesn't like a good comeback story? Sometimes though, a game can do the opposite, and instead have a potential that has so much going for it, and a game that is good, but also fails to capitalize on everything it could offer. And for 2023, that game for sure is Lethal Company. It's a small indie project made by one guy where you get to play with up to 3 friends as space haulers that have to go to different planets to grab things to meet a quota, which unlocks new planets, more money to buy cool gear, and new things to do. The premise is super basic, but because of the creepy atmosphere and monsters, the game went absolutely viral at the end of the year on TikTok and caused a massive wave of players to rush to the title to enjoy and make memories. And even despite the low polygon graphics and janky animations, the game has such a unique sense of heart to it that, especially for the first couple of hours, makes it so fun to play. Things like in-game proximity chat where you can faintly hear your partner screaming in the distance, or walkie-talkies that allow for one space captain to sit in the ship and talk to companions inside a zone surrounded by monsters as he leads them through it all, make the game so uniquely interesting. But sadly, after those first couple of hours or days playing the game, it starts to get a lot more stale. Every planet looks almost the same, the interiors are copy-pasted rooms endlessly, and the monsters lose their sense of edge once you've seen them so many times. It's hard to fault the developer though, since it's just one guy who was making something to use on his resume, but still, the core of this game and its ideas are so awesome and fun that it almost makes me wish there was a bigger team here that could make more content and provide more polish. The tactile nature of the gameplay is so special, where you have to do things like actually type on the keyboards in order to loot, being able to move containers around the ship to troll friends, or switching the lights on and off. It's such a great setup for what could be a game that provides endless hours of fun, but because it's so shallow after that initial excitement wears off, it quickly fades away. In some ways, it reminds me of games like Fall Guys or Among Us that had a big blow up and then faded away a little more after, but this time with even less content. The reason I find this example example a lot more interesting though is I think the core game design and concepts here have a lot more staying power than either of those previous other two titles, and if there was, say, tons of more planets with lots of new gadgets and monsters, along with meta progression systems to always give us a carrot on a stick, this game could have a staying power that Fall Guys and Among Us never did. And that's why I think Lethal Company is the game with the most unrealized potential, one that while it is already wildly successful and fun, could have been so much more and reached even greater heights had it been realized completely on initial release. But once again, I can't fault the creator at all for this. The game could have just as easily been ignored and all the extra effort would have meant lost time and crippling debt to pay for contractors. My only fear is that the big budget version of this game that will inevitably come out eventually might not capture the same magic this game did when playing it for the first time with friends. One of my favorite types of videos to make on this channel are ones about philosophical questions in games, or essays on games that just in general really make you think. To me, a game's ability to make us ponder about our real lives and the meaning intrinsic to nature is something that lasts with you so much longer than just good shooting mechanics ever could. And considering that, it's no surprise that often some of my favorite games every year are ones that focus on a lot of big philosophical questions and answers, with my favorite all year in this category being the Talos Principle 2. And that's because the Talos Principle is such an underrated and awesome series that tasks the player with going through endless rooms of puzzles to uncover the main story secrets, all while contemplating life's biggest questions all along the way. And even though I've never really enjoyed puzzle games all that much, the Talos Principle 2 manages to really make challenge fun because of a focus on spatial reasoning, along with constantly throwing new mechanics at the player. There are over 12 zones on this journey, all with their own unique gameplay elements like being able to control multiple bodies, handling moving platforms with lasers, or literally turning the world upside down. Each puzzle is challenging enough to make you think and feel accomplished, but also not so overbearing that the pacing of the game is sacrificed. If anything, I almost wish there was more challenging puzzles, because once you get the hang of things, it can feel almost too easy at times. But luckily, there are golden puzzles you can unlock at the end of the game that are much harder, and there's a planned DLC that should be focused on bringing the most difficult things and challenges to the game. The real thing that makes this game so engaging though is how during and in between each puzzle you will be talking with companions or reading terminals that all focus on either questions from the game or ancient texts from real life philosophers that will make you think about things like religion, the meaning of life, love, and hope. And on top of this, the main story is solely focused on this goal of making the player think as well, where you will be traveling to different islands and talking to gods about a variety of topics on the human condition. And seeing as you play as a sentient machine that is gaining consciousness, it makes for the perfect setting for thinking about topics like this. Strangely enough too, this game has some of the best environments out there as well, even as a puzzle game, with a huge variety of locations all vast in scope and scale that were meant to show off being, well, one of the first games in Unreal Engine 5. And it really pays off here, because it makes what otherwise can sometimes feel like a formulaic puzzle game so much more introspective and interesting to just adventure around in. Because once again, the reason I actually enjoyed this game so much was because it managed to scratch an itch that so few games do, making me actually think about life while playing. And because of the setting and questions it asks, there are some truly profound moments that not only are a spectacle in terms of graphics and presentation, but also because of the effect they have on your mind. The quote-unquote boss battles in this game aren't trying to bring down a giant behemoth's health bar to zero, but rather figuring out the decisions you want to make at the end of the game that can alter the entire course of civilization itself and lead to multiple awesome different endings. Without a doubt, the Talos Principle series is one of the most underrated out there that makes you think logically as well as introspectively and leaves you affected even well after the playthrough has been finished. I truly hope that the final game in this trilogy can really reach the huge audience it deserves and show the world that this is the first puzzle series since Portal that almost anyone can pick up and love. One of the most interesting things for me about this year though was just how much I agreed with everyone. Whether that be the masses finally thinking Cyberpunk 2077 was amazing, Baldur's Gate 3 being game of the year, or Starfield missing the mark, I actually tended to find myself on the same side as most gamers for once. Which is strange because one of the main reasons I started this channel in the first place was because I had so many opinions about games in this industry I felt really strongly about that I saw no one else voicing. But don't worry, I have one of those for this year too. And that's for a game that didn't even come out this year, but one I finally got around to playing for the first time, Disco Elysium. It's a title that is regarded by many as one of, if not the best RPG of all time, and tells the story of a drunken man waking up and solving a murder that turns into a story about life, politics, and the human psyche. It's actually one of the best written games of all time without a doubt, and you would think for someone like me who's a sucker for great writing, that would mean I would be in love. But sadly, it couldn't be any further from the truth. From the moment the game started, I just felt bored, honestly. And this isn't from one playthrough. It's from now 3 where I have forced myself over and over again to try and understand why people love this game so much, and without fail, each time I played this year, I couldn't ever feel the magic. And that's because what on the surface is great writing with super interesting leveling systems where you quite literally dive into the inner subconscious of your character as you learn more about them, becomes mundane and uninteresting to me because I just didn't connect with the setting of Revachol and the new world at all. I personally find this satire on the Paris communes inspired by Karl Marx to just be boring. The streets are so full of people with amazing writing and questions about humanity and society's struggle against capitalism and socialism alike, but I just didn't really enjoy talking to anyone at all. Everyone's analogies are almost too abstract. The narrator and how he speaks feels like the game is taking itself too seriously even in moments of absurdity. The skill system and how it feels so pretentious trying to obfuscate simple mechanics. In other games similar to this, I tended to like having to pull back the nature of the writing and systems to understand everything that was going on. Like say for example Planescape Torment, a game that I think is really amazing and is very similar to this one. But in Disco Elysium, when I level up a Script de Corpse at the start, I get that it changes my relationship towards cops in the game, which plays a big role, and I do like that too much or too little of any one of these skills can have drastic effects on the world and change what happens in conversations, where your mind might take over and ruin a skill check because, for example, you can't control your encyclopedia upgrade, meaning you can't stop thinking about everything you know. I really do adore this system in principle, and it's really cool and allows for a lot of emergent storytelling, but it just feels like the game's writing always wants to be one step ahead of you, even when it's not. Sometimes making things more clear and simple can be better too. On top of this as well, the main story is so slow for me, and the reveals almost never were exciting in my opinion, meaning the most interesting parts of the game were about the scab and dock worker union struggles and the philosophical questions they asked. But even there, the writing is just so obscured that I had trouble thinking about all the interesting questions the game was posing without feeling like I was listening to a lecture from a pretentious university professor who thought their high IQ and affinity to the Communist Manifesto meant everyone in the world needed to hear their voice. Even having said all that though, I can see how for some, this game is so beloved. And there were certain quests on my journey that were fantastic, like one where you get to investigate a haunting near a store and climb all the way to the top floor to uncover what's really going on, with a lot of commentary on modern society along the way. But I'd be lying if I said I was engaged the whole way through. Most of the time I was simply sitting at my screen not only bored, but rolling my eyes at a good amount of the dialogue that felt obscured for the sake of obscurity itself. Most of all though, I think the reason I love something like say Planescape Torment but have trouble here is because the setting of Planescape Torment was so much more interesting to me, and Revachol fell flat in so many ways. I didn't like the annoying characters like Kuno, I didn't care about the politics or love stories, and overall, it just isn't a game for me. And that doesn't mean in any way it's a bad game at all. More so, I was just surprised to find that I disliked it so much. I thought I would really love it. But often with games like this, you have to be in the right mood to play them, and maybe this just wasn't the year for that. So let me know down below for those of you that do love this game, because I know there's lots of you, why you do as well. And maybe someday in the future, I'll come back and finally see what makes this game a masterpiece to so many. Sometimes even the initial playthrough or impression of a game can be the one that leaves a mark and tells a story that lasts with you for a long time. And maybe the best surprise of the entire year for me was none other than Hi-Fi Rush. It's the type of game that in most circumstances I never would have given a shot, but because of its awesome shadow drop reveal and release on the same day, I decided to. Because you see, Hi-Fi Rush is a lot more than just another rhythm action game full of combos. It's a title that's full of heart and a lovable cast of characters, along with one of the funnest soundtracks of all time. And all that comes together in a package with a whimsical and memorable art style and animation framework that puts most big budget anime to shame. Maybe the most surprising part of all, though, is that Tango Gameworks' previous games were horror bouts full of jump scares and psychological torture, while Hi-Fi Rush couldn't be any further from that. Screaming monsters are swapped out for comedic robots, dark hallways for giant colorful landscapes, and demented scenes for moments full of upbeat music blasting as you take down a big boss. And more than any other game I played this year, Hi-Fi is all about the fun, so singularly focused on that one goal of making sure the player at every moment is just having a good time. Bosses don't take themselves too seriously, your team is used for comedic relief half the time, and your main character is a bumbling buffoon but with such an endearing heart for others. At times it even feels like the Saturday morning cartoons of old, but here with even better writing, where there will be multiple times where cutscenes will actually have you laughing, or others where you will be amazed by what's going on screen. At the core of it all, though, is the music, and it really highlights how important music is in games. For each hit of the rhythm on beat while playing the game, the world will move along to that same beat as you go, and in order to pull off the strongest combos in game, you need to time your attacks and movements right on the beat in order to make every encounter hit. For each hit of the rhythm while playing the game, the world will move along to the beat as you go, and in order to pull off the strongest combos in game, you need to time your attacks and movements right on the beat in order to take on the hardest encounters. It can be jarring at first, but once you get the hang of it, Hi-Fi really shines as you almost feel like you're part of a musical as you dash and bash your way through each environment while your character and you are both bobbing to the beat. And this only gets more impressive during boss battles, where famous and recognizable music scores start to blare as you work to figure out how to take down each boss, some of which have very unique mechanics and cutscenes that make it all so fun. Especially on that first playthrough too, there are so many times where I was surprised with just how good the characters and games are. Usually when a smaller title like this shadow drops, it turns out to be cool but nothing special. But here, every single character you met, whether friend, foe, or animatronic cat, has a ton of personality and adds a lot to every scene. In fact, my favorite moments in this entire game weren't the combat or boss battles at all, but actually the scenes where you get to see your team come together, or the more heartfelt moments that make this game a lot more than just another action adventure. Because at the core of Hi-Fi Rush is a soul full of amazing music, very memorable characters, and some moments that will have you grinning from ear to ear because of what's happening on screen. And on top of all of that too, the transitions from cutscene to gameplay are so impressive and seamless and make it feel like one moment you're playing an awesome new rhythm game and the next you're watching the new best sci-fi cartoon out there. Truly though, the reason Hi-Fi Rush was the most surprising game for me this year is because it managed to make me fall in love with a genre I otherwise usually dislike and avoid, and turn me from a skeptic into someone who absolutely adores the game. Especially the final 3 levels are just such a mastery of storytelling, endearing moments, epic fights, and great music that I hope more than anything Xbox greenlights a big budget sequel to this game that maybe more people can finally reach out and see what makes this series so awesome. I'm one of those types of gamers who will give anything a shot, and while I like certain genres like RPGs more than others, I have played just about everything out there and tend to enjoy almost all of it. But one type of game I played more of as a kid and haven't dived that deeply into in a while is the management sims that focus on creating vast metropolises of industry or ingenuity. I liked Factorio and others, but they always just felt like they were lacking either polish, presentation, or depth. However, this year I finally got around to really diving into the Dyson Sphere program, and even before its full initial release, I can say it's one of the most addicting and fun management games I've played in a long time. In Dyson Sphere program, you play as a robot landing on a new planet where you must initially set up extractors on multiple resource veins and build conveyor belts that move raw materials to refineries and other contraptions that eventually produce materials to be used in further building and research. This quickly devolves into massive landscapes full of miles of moving parts that all intertwine together into something so fun. I can't express just how addictive it is trying to get enough materials to fund your next upgrade, and optimizing each step of your supply line so that the input and output from grabbers, extractors, conveyor belts, and research stations all work in perfect harmony. And now with things like alien invasions where you must build defenses on every planet you deem important, the game has so many deep and interesting systems that you can play for 100 hours and still always be learning something new or figuring out a way you can improve your current process. worlds. Unlike other games in this genre too, the main goal of building a Dyson sphere around a sun is just so much cooler, and the presentation, whether it be the elegant graphics or easy to use and understand UI, make this series so accessible finally for the first time. It really does just get you into the rhythm of feeling like you are constantly improving, and it's one of those games where you will start it up and before you know it, 3 hours have passed and your planet looks almost unrecognizable from before, now filled to the brim with mechanical contraptions. Even for people that aren't usually into games like this, I highly recommend it because of how satisfying it is to play. You can watch every single bit of raw material you mine go from factory and be transformed into new materials step by step and be in awe at the whole process. Or what about crafting a massive drone network that will bring all your materials you need without you even having to do anything? Huge mega structures that facilitate trade across planets countless light years away, and overall building a gargantuan network of material fodders that all feed into the greatest accomplishment known to man, a Dyson sphere, to capture the essence and unlimited power of a sun. It's a game that is as mellow as it is intense and will let you flip on a podcast and relax while always feeling a sense of pride and accomplishment as you slowly improve everything you're building. By far the most addicting game I played all year. I've always been a sucker for a good thriller. I love movies that include strange and odd occurrences, books that ask the big questions, and most of all, games that keep you on the edge of your seat. And well, Alan Wake 2 is without a doubt one of the best we've seen in years. The narrative is as perplexing and unwieldy as the world itself, and uncovering the secrets behind Bright Falls and the Dark Place make for such an enrapturing mystery. The way in which the game combines cutscenes and real actors with gameplay too is so unique for the genre and the best Remedy has done to date, which results in an extremely well done artistic piece that focuses on making you question what is really going on the whole time. I didn't even particularly love the combat in this one, especially compared to their previous game Control, but the story and twists and turns on offer here are simply a cut above almost any other game out there. That creepy feeling all the townsfolk give you as you walk by, the eerie sounds of the woods as you traverse their ancient bark, or scenes of pure horror like happening upon a foster home that hides a demonic presence. It's a type of game that is so niche in a lot of ways, yet at the same time would be loved by so many if they gave it a shot. For me though, the standout here is the narrative and thriller aspects, where you get to play as two different characters, both with their own special powers, to piece together mysteries or change the entire story altogether. Because the Alan Wake series is all about stories, isn't it? About a writer who has trapped himself and other innocent bystanders in a hellish dark place from which there's no escape, and this leads to levels that feel almost psychedelic in nature, allowing for some of the coolest moments in a game all year. If you know, you know. And more than anything, it's a story and world that has so much life and awe, where every new location is filled with secrets and interesting tidbits that give you hints as to what's really going on, giving you that same feeling you get when you watch a really good crime documentary, where you're always questioning who the bad guys really are and what actually happened. And even with how confusing and meta the story can be at times, it still manages to stay grounded enough to provide some really awesome thrills that also lean so much into fantastical horror elements as well. But as always, thank you guys so much for watching, and let me know down below what your favorite and least favorite games of 2023 were and why. And for anyone that likes this channel or the content I make here, make sure to check out my TikTok, Instagram, and X accounts as well to see more of my personal life, along with the membership program if you want to help me out financially to pay for a lot of the people that I can hire to help on this channel to produce higher and higher quality content at a faster rate. Again, thank you guys so much for the support, and I'll see you guys all next time.